Thank you very much. We have a guest speaker today, somebody that I don't believe has ever been to our church. Is that right? Pastor George Crumley is the treasurer of the Rocky Mountain Conference. He has been in our conference for about a year and a half. He came from the Indiana conference, which is where Gary Thurber came from, and now that they're here, he left, I guess. So I don't know how they feel about that. I know how we feel about it. We're not happy about that at all. But his wife is also with him, Rhonda, and we're glad that you can be with us today. And I know that the Lord will bless us as we hear his message this morning. And so welcome.
Good morning. You know, that is a genuine loss for this conference to be losing Elder Thurber. I had the opportunity to work with him in Indiana, and we worked together for 6 or 7 years. And then when we came here, Rhonda and I were excited to be able to work with him and Diane again, and had that opportunity for about a year and a half. But they're going back to the Lake Union Conference, where he'll be there at the Lake Union office. So it's a real loss, and that's a consistent theme that I've heard from others as I've been out in churches or at the conference office or on a phone call. There's a consistent theme where people are saying, boy, we sure hate to lose Elder Thurber. Just for information, in terms of a little bit of changes taking place besides that within the conference, is effective November 1, we have Dan Hansen, who has come to be our new ministries director at Glacier View Ranch. He's come from Camp Asabo, where he was their director there, and so he is joining us effective November 1. And then also from Camp Asabo, effective December 1, we have Everett Jameson coming, who will be the assistant ministries director there at Glacier View Ranch. So they're both coming from Michigan Conference, and we're probably have probably not endeared ourselves to Michigan Conference, because I know both of those individuals were valued there. But they're going to be either have arrived or shortly arriving at Glacier View Ranch. And I want to express my appreciation for the children's story that was shared and the music that was shared. You know, when people have gifts and talents, for them to be able to share those gifts and talents with us, it's a way that we can all benefit and all be blessed. And I know I was encouraged and I was blessed as I was able to listen to both items that were shared this morning. Let's go ahead and bow our heads for prayer. Dear Lord, I just pray that your Holy Spirit will be here in a mighty way as we spend just a few minutes together in your word here during this service. Lord, without the help of the Holy Spirit, this really cannot mean much to any one of us, and so I pray that your Spirit will be poured out for Jesus' sake. Amen. Take your Bibles and turn to Daniel chapter 3. We're going to be looking at a story that I'm sure most of us are familiar with. Maybe all of us are familiar with Daniel chapter 3. And I've always enjoyed the book of Daniel. And if you want to be encouraged in regards to a life well lived, you can discover that life in the book of Daniel, as Daniel indeed lived a good life at a very high level of responsibility. Daniel chapter 3, and we're going to start here. We're going to just spend all our time here. We're just going to kind of move through this chapter and see what we can learn from it. Verses 1 and 2 says this: Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So here, according to verse 1 and 2, and out of my translation, basically King Nebuchadnezzar has built a magnificent image, about 100 feet tall, if you were to convert the cubits to feet, about 100 feet tall, set it up in the plain of Dura, and it was made out of gold, from head to toe, made out of gold. Now it's interesting, if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, just the prior chapter, there had also been an image that King Nebuchadnezzar had seen in a dream. Isn't that right? Was that image made completely of gold? No. There was a head of gold, but then there was a progression into other metals representing other kingdoms as you proceeded down that image that he saw. But here, he constructed an image completely of gold. And I wonder sometimes if he was bothered by that dream where he knew that Babylon would have an end. That when the head of gold was done, there would be another subsequent kingdom to follow. And that may have bothered him a bit, so maybe he set up an image completely of gold in the plain of Dura, 100 feet tall, for people to come there in his kingdom. Now, it's interesting. Let's look on a little further. Verses 4, 5, 6, and 7. It says this, "Then a herald cried aloud, 'To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony, with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace.' So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre, and symphony, with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up." You know, it's interesting, at least in my translation, I think I've looked at a couple others. Initially, it's using the word, "come to a dedication service." And then that word is shifted to, "we're having a worship service." But that word worship or worshipped is used about 3 times in verses 4 through 7. And I went to my dictionary and I looked up, what does it mean to worship? And here's a dictionary definition. Worship means extreme devotion. That's one way you can define worship. It means intense love. It's another way you can define worship. It means intense admiration. It's a third way you can define worship. Or to adore. So, based on that definition, worship is more than just duty. It's an expression of love. Isn't that right? It's an expression of devotion that you have for someone that you love. That's how you define worship. Well, you know, with that definition in mind, I sometimes wonder, as we come to church each Sabbath, are we doing that out of a sense of duty, or because we deeply love God and want to come and worship Him? You know, I came across a quote that talks about human activity and how even human activity, things that seem common, can actually be a way of worship. Listen to this. Every human activity except sin, every human activity except sin, can be done for God's pleasure if you do it with an attitude of praise. You can wash dishes, repair a machine, sell a product, write a computer program, grow a crop, and raise a family for the glory of God. You know, a lot of times we think, that's just a mundane task. What in the world would that even have to do with worship? But how we do what seems like a mundane task can be an expression of our love toward God. An expression of our love toward God. Well, let's look on a little further here. Verses 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And this is what it says. Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. What they said, was it true? There was an element of truth there, because indeed these men did not serve the gods of King Nebuchadnezzar, but it implied that these men maybe, just maybe, were not faithful to King Nebuchadnezzar. And that wasn't true, because I can imagine in his palace they were probably about the most faithful outside of Daniel. They were very faithful men who served the king faithfully, and these men came accusing them, in a sense, of being unfaithful. You know, it's not fun to be falsely accused, is it? I remember years ago when our daughter Tony was first born in 1990. We were living in Grand Ledge, Michigan, and Rhonda was a stay-at-home mom at that stage in our lives. And so she was home that day with Tony. Tony was about a year and a half old by then. I'm not sure exactly, but around that age. And she was in the living room playing with a neighborhood friend, and Rhonda was in the kitchen doing some work. And all of a sudden, Rhonda heard just a terrible scream coming from the living room. And so Rhonda went racing into the living room, and there was Tony laying on the floor holding her leg, crying out in pain. Well, Rhonda tried to figure out what had happened, but wasn't able to do a good job of figuring out what had actually happened, and Tony continued to scream and cry and hold her leg, her lower leg. So Rhonda scooped her up, got the neighborhood friend, put him in the car, and raced to a place where she could receive medical attention. She got there. Doctor spent some time looking at Tony's leg, took some x-rays, and came in and told Rhonda that Tony had a broken leg. And so she said, we need to put a cast on that leg. And so they casted it and everything. And just about the time Rhonda was getting ready to leave, the doctor said, and by the way, I need to let you know, on the x-ray, that break was a very unusual looking break. And because of the unusualness of the break, I need to report you to social services. Now, the doctor was doing their job. That's their responsibility. And Rhonda understood that. And so Rhonda said, yes, I understand. And so then Tony and Rhonda left and went home. Well, a few days later, Rhonda was there at home with Tony, and of course Tony had her leg all casted. Back then I think it was a plaster cast, or maybe, I don't know, maybe it was fiberglass, I forget. But anyway, it's all casted, and there came a knock at our back door there in Grand Ledge, because that's the way people came to our house, was up on a wooden deck, and they would knock on the back door. And so Rhonda went there and opened the door, and there was a lady who identified herself as being from social services. And she said, you know, I have been notified I need to come and just do a brief visit with you. Could I come in and just sit down for a few minutes? So Rhonda said, sure, come on in. So the lady came in. They came through the kitchen, went into the living room and sat down, and the lady started asking Rhonda questions. She asked this question, that question, how did it happen, and so forth. And after about a half hour, the lady left. Well, Rhonda, later that day when we had an opportunity to talk, Rhonda says, boy, you know, even though I have a completely clear conscience, just by virtue of the way that the lady was asking the questions, and I knew it was her job, I felt guilty. I felt falsely accused. Well, time went by, and maybe another week, and Rhonda and Tony were out on the back wooden porch. And Tony was going up and down the wooden steps. It goes about 3 steps that go down to a cement sidewalk, and then up 3 steps and down 3 steps, and she was holding onto the banister. She had her casted leg. And as she was making her way down, and Rhonda's about 3 feet away, fairly close by, she was making her way down, holding onto the banister. Somehow she lost her balance and went tumbling down the balance of the steps and hit her forehead on the cement sidewalk. And immediately she started just crying out in pain. So Rhonda scooped her up, brought her into the kitchen, and it was a little bloody, and Rhonda got it all cleaned up, and eventually Tony's crying subsided. Nothing that needed any sort of medical attention. Well, a few more days went by, and that wound turned into a very, very dark-looking bruise. Okay? Very noticeable. And about the time that bruise was about the worst it could look, there came a knock at the back door. And so Rhonda went to answer the door, but she thought, I'll just look out the side window before I answer the door. So she looked out, and there was the lady from social services. And she thought, oh no, if I answer that door, and that lady from social services, who is doing her job, happens to see that bruise, she won't believe a word that I say. And so Rhonda didn't answer the door. The lady had not seen Rhonda looking out the window. So the lady knocked again, and maybe she knocked a 3rd time, and Rhonda didn't answer the door. And eventually the lady got in her car and left and never returned. You know, it's not fun to be falsely accused or to feel like you're being falsely accused, is it? And yet I would like to suggest today that when we are extremely devoted to God, there may be times in our life when we will be falsely accused. Isn't that right? People are going to see things in us that they really don't like, and they're going to put a spin on something that falsely accuses our actions. When we are extremely devoted to God, there may or will be times when we are falsely accused. Well, let's look on a little further here. Let's look at verse 13. It says this, Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now if you are ready, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony, with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? You know, I know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were committed young men. And I know that as they stood there before the king, and as he talked with them, they knew that probably an awful lot of people were looking on. Their peers were looking on. And the king was giving them another chance, which I have to believe he was giving them a second chance because he knew the quality of these young men. He had come in contact with them before. Because normally, I don't think a king with that stature would have given them a second chance. But he gave them another chance. And a thought entered my mind, and I don't know if this was anything they were struggling with. But you have to wonder, as they sensed everyone looking on, as they realized the king was giving them another chance, if they may have been tempted just a bit at that stage in their minds to compromise. You sometimes wonder if maybe that thought went through their mind just briefly, that God maybe was providing them an out, by giving them a different type of a chance. The point I want to make is that when we are extremely devoted to God, we will be tempted to compromise at times. There will be tests that come our direction, that are allowed to come our direction by God, to test our faith. And there will be times when we as individuals are tempted to compromise. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego may have been tempted to compromise. And the interesting thing about compromise is it can primarily take two different forms. There's two different things that can cause people to want to compromise. One can be inconvenience. It's not convenient to do the right thing. I don't know if any of you noticed that brief news story about a bus driver, and I even forget what city it was in. He was driving along, and he noticed a young lady standing on kind of the edge of a bridge. Now, he could have just kind of disregarded that and said, I have to meet my schedule. She's probably just looking over the bridge. He may not have taken it seriously, but for some reason, he felt convicted to stop. And when he stopped, he opened the door of his bus, and he called out to her, and he realized that she was on the verge, maybe, of jumping over the edge of that bridge to end her life. And so he got out, and he slowly approached her, helped her back, I believe, over the banister, and they sat down there until the police arrived. That man was inconvenienced, but he did the right thing, didn't he? I'm sure his delivery was not on time, but he did the right thing. Or another reason that we can be tempted to compromise is out of fear. Think of Peter when he was there in the courtyard, and remember they were saying, "Hey, do you belong to Jesus?" And Peter said, "No, I don't know him. I don't know who he is." And he even started swearing to try to confirm that he had no friendship with Jesus Christ. Many times, because of fear, we are tempted to compromise. Isn't that right? Well, let's look on a little further here. This is really the center of the story, verses 16, 17, and 18. Everything, in a sense, rises or falls on these verses. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." Did you notice it? Did you notice what's taking place in verse 17 and then what's taking place in verse 18? Well, let me share with you what I see in verse 17. I see verse 17 as an expression of faith. That's what I see in verse 17, an expression of faith. But then in verse 18, I see an expression of surrender. In other words, God can do what he wants to do. He can deliver. But if he chooses not to do that, we're still going to be faithful to him. And I'd like to suggest today that genuine faith, I believe, always precedes genuine surrender. Maybe some of you did this when you were younger. I remember as a younger person, you get with your friends and they say, "Hey, close your eyes, we'll stand behind you," and then you just fall backwards and we'll catch you. Have you ever done that or seen that done? Now, are you going to close your eyes and fall backwards if you don't believe that your friends have your best interest at heart? You're probably not. But if you really believe your friends that they're going to be faithful and true, you're going to be willing to surrender, close your eyes, and fall backwards. Isn't that right? So I would like to suggest that faith or belief, I believe, always precedes genuine surrender. Well, let's go on here as we're moving quickly through the balance of this story. Verse 19, we see the king's response. And I'm reading out of the New King James. We're going to read a number of verses, but I'm going to emphasize a word that's used in my translation. Now, it may be used in your translations, or maybe they use tied up, or instead of bound or bind or bound. But just listen as we go through here, starting in verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, so he was not a happy person. And the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." "Look," he answered, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." You know, it's interesting, that word bound, or variations on that word, were used a number of times as I read through those verses. And I want to bring a point out here today. You know, it's easy to think, because of the lives we've lived and the struggles we've had and how many times we've tried and how many times we've failed, it's easy to think, because of what Satan whispers in our ear, that we'll never be a victorious and successful Christian. Satan comes along and says, you know, you have tried to get away from that sin too many times. You might as well quit trying, because you're never going to get away from it. You're bound. But I'd like to suggest today that we are not bound when Jesus Christ is standing next to us. When they were thrown into that fiery furnace, there all of a sudden was a person in the fire with them, and that was Jesus Christ. And all of a sudden they were loose. And I would like to suggest today that when Jesus is by our side, he sets us free, no matter what it is that we're going through. And the reality is, when we're extremely devoted to God, there may be times when our very lives are threatened, like their very lives were threatened. But Jesus was by their side during that difficult time. Well, finally, the final 3 verses here that I'm going to have us look at in our time together. It says this: Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth, this is verse 26, the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together. And they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of the fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. You know, that is to me an amazing story. To think that people could be thrown in a flaming fire, that even those who threw them in that fire died from the heat, that they could be thrown in that flaming fire, walk around, come out, and not even smell like smoke. It's an amazing story. Let me ask you, at the end of that day, when all these leaders went back to their responsibilities, what do you think they went home talking about that day? Did they go home talking about the great nation of Babylon and the great King Nebuchadnezzar? Or did they go home talking about the God of heaven? They went home talking about the God of heaven. Now here's the good news. The good news is that when we're extremely devoted to God, we can and will make a difference in those we come in contact with. Whether it's in our homes, we'll make a difference when we're extremely devoted to God. Whether it's in our places of work, we'll make a difference when we're extremely devoted to God. Whether it's in our neighborhood, our community, we'll make a difference when we're extremely devoted to God. That's the good news. It may be a little difficult at times, but in the end, God uses us to bring glory to His name. And we can make a difference in the lives of those around us. You see, if those three had never taken a stand, would they have made a difference that day? No. They would have never made a difference in that nation. But because they took a stand, they made a huge difference in that nation. And we can make a difference when we take a stand for Jesus Christ. Well, this whole idea of devotion. I want to end with a story. When our kids were young, we were in Indiana, and they kept begging us for a pet. And we really weren't in favor of a pet. We hadn't had a pet for a few years, and as you all know, that when you have a pet, there's greater responsibility, isn't that right? And so they kept working on Dad and Mom for a pet. And initially it was a cat. And I had been raised with cats, and so I was at least open to that idea. And I knew that cats were fairly independent. And so I thought, if we're going to have a pet, that may not be a bad type of pet to have. But then Rhonda brought to my attention that when we had been at some people's homes a couple times who had cats, Tony had seemed to have some sort of a minor allergic reaction. Her eyes would get a little runny, or maybe her nose. And so Rhonda says, maybe a cat wouldn't be best. And we told the kids that. A cat probably wouldn't be best, Tony, because you seem to have this allergic reaction. Well, then they started pushing us for a dog. And they were very persistent in their requests for a pet dog. Well, we did something to try to placate them, but it was really a bad decision on our part. We went down to the Humane Society, and we said, we'll just go down there and just look at some dogs, but we have no plans of getting a dog. So we went down to the Humane Society and looked at those little dogs, and the kids were pointing out all the dogs they wanted, and they said, what about this dog, or what about this dog? And I would always tell them, well, these dogs are mixed breeds, and even though they're small now, they're probably going to grow to be a very large dog. And if we ever did have a dog, we really don't want a large dog. And so we took them there 2 or 3 times just to kind of placate them, okay? Well, one day when I was at work, I got a call from Rhonda. And she said, I just want to alert you, when you come home today, there's going to be a dog at home. She had been over visiting her friend Tammy, and Tammy had this small dog that had been dropped off, and Tammy wasn't able to look after that dog, and she said to Rhonda, would you at least take the dog for a short time and until we can find a home for the dog? And so Rhonda said, okay, I'll take the dog. So, she was just calling me to alert me that when I got home there would be this, small dog there at home, a pup dog, a younger dog. So when I got home, there this dog was, a white dog, and very friendly, but very well behaved. It wasn't jumping up on me, it wasn't biting things like you thought a puppy might be biting, but very well behaved. And so, we had that dog for 2 or 3 days, and when I would come home at the end of the day, I'd say to Rhonda, "Do you have any success in finding a home for the dog today?" And she'd say, "No, I haven't had any success." She was trying, she was putting forth effort, but she hadn't had any success. And that went on for a few days, and then she began to realize, and I began to realize, that we probably weren't going to have success in finding a home for that dog. And so we talked about it one evening when I got home. Apart from the kids, we said, the kids have been wanting a dog, and this seems like such a well-behaved dog. It was potty trained, it didn't jump up, it didn't bite things, it didn't bark much. And so we decided to go out and tell the kids that we were going to keep this dog. And so we went out and told the kids, and they were elated. It just made their evening to know that we were going to be able to keep that dog. And that dog's name was Shadow. Well, that was a number of years ago. In fact, that's probably about 13 years ago. And Shadow is no longer a little dog. You see, Shadow's about a 130-pound indoor dog. It's a huge dog. But Shadow, over the years, has been just as amiable, friendly, never been aggressive to anyone type of dog as you could imagine. And over the years, wherever we've been as a family, Shadow has always been there with us. If we're in the living room, Shadow's just laying on the floor there in the living room with us. If we go into the bedroom to go to sleep at night, Shadow comes in, lays down by our bed, and goes to sleep. If we're in the kitchen, Shadow comes into the kitchen, hangs out in the kitchen. If I'm in my office, Shadow comes into my office. But there's something that Shadow has always not liked. It's when any one of us or all of us go through a door in the house and shut the door behind us and leave Shadow on the other side of that door. That breaks Shadow's heart. And Shadow just sits on the other side of the door, doesn't claw the door, doesn't bark, but just cries. And it breaks our heart when Shadow does that. And it's not long before someone in the family takes their hand, puts it on the doorknob, and opens that door and lets Shadow in. And Shadow comes walking in, wagging his tail, because you see, Shadow is extremely devoted to us. He always wants to be with us. Revelation says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in." These 3 Hebrew youth were extremely devoted to God. But the bottom line is that God is extremely devoted to us. Isn't that right? He continues and continues and continues to pursue us. It says His mercy endures forever. God loves us. He cares for us. He's extremely devoted to us. And because of that, I hope that each one of us are extremely devoted to Him. That each day we spend time in prayer and study so that we can have the type of relationship with Him that He craves to have with each one of us.